Chapter 8. Black Americans. Today, about 39 million of the 300 million people in the USA are black. They used to live mostly in the South, working in the cotton and tobacco fields. A story about the hard life of slaves, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, was very popular in the mid-19th century. It made a lot of people see that keeping slaves was wrong, and it told the exciting story of how a slave family escaped using the Underground Railway. This was not a real railway, but a number of places where slaves could find help. People in each house could show them the way to the next safe house. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass were famous slaves who helped many other slaves to escape from the South to the North using the Underground Railway. Frederick Douglass escaped in 1838 and started to work for the freedom of other black people. He had understood that in order to be free, he needed to learn to read and write, and he wrote a book about his life. After this, he traveled to Europe to speak about slavery, and later returned to New York and started several newspapers. During the Civil War, he told black men to join the army to fight for the North, and after the war, he worked for the government. Harriet Tubman traveled 140 kilometers to freedom in 1849 with the help of white people and free blacks. Although it was dangerous, she returned in order to help her family, and she bravely said, "I can only die once." In the 1850s, she helped more than 300 slaves escape. After the Civil War, white Southerners were angry that they had lost the war and angry that slaves were now free. They showed a lot of prejudice against black people. Some white people joined the Ku Klux Klan, groups of men who dressed in white, covered their faces, and went out to beat and murder black people. Black men could not vote until 1870, and even after they got the right to vote, they often did not use it because they were frightened. The book To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee tells the frightening story of a black man, Tom Robinson, in 1930s Alabama. Although Tom has done nothing wrong, people easily believe that he is a criminal, just because he is black. In the 20th century, black people began to travel to the cities of the North to look for work. So there are now more black people in the North than in the South. But even in the North, they lived separately. In the South, they had to sit separately on buses and eat in separate parts of restaurants. Until 1954, they also had to go to different schools. Then, in the 1950s, a churchman called Martin Luther King began to fight for the civil rights of black people. Groups of black people started to break the law, but not in a violent way. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a woman called Rosa Parks became famous when she refused to give her seat on a bus to a white man. Then more black people refused to use the buses, and the bus companies lost a lot of money. Black people also started to go into whites-only restaurants. In August 1963, 200,000 people met in Washington and heard Martin Luther King speak about the need for black people to be equal with white people. He began with these words which have become famous. I Have a Dream. Finally, in 1964, a law was passed which gave black people their rights, and Martin Luther King was given the Nobel Peace Prize. But in 1968, he was murdered in Memphis, and fighting started in more than 100 cities. During the 1970s and 1980s, prejudice against black people slowly began to appear less often, and many black people now have good jobs in business and government. A black woman like Condoleezza Rice can represent the American government in other countries, and perhaps even think about becoming president. But there are still problems. When Hurricane Katrina destroyed the city of New Orleans in 2005, most of the people who lost their houses were black. Many of them waited a long time for help from the government. Was it because they were black? A lot of people think so.